And this is what it seemed at the time when I said it. The task seems to be attempting to name the political technology that constitutes a habitat for our objects. So maybe that notion of habitat is the nation building 1.0 and 2.0. Maybe that's what I was working towards. Can you see origins of our objects of governance? Can you identify a trajectory of your objects coming to life? That would be sort of doing a genealogy. You don't have to do that, and probably most of us will not. But that's what they're doing. So what I've done is just annotated with red underline. And they're naming what their article's about. So they're identifying new forms of vulnerability that are really constituted by the acceptance of an infrastructure. When you've got an infrastructure, you've got a vulnerability because it gets holes in it. So they're proposing that in a way as they're interested in describing the development of technical methods to identify and manage threats to vital systems. So in other words, they're working within this idea of infrastructure. Okay, so, and they're pointing to a range of significant things, objects in our terms, objects of governance, that are internalised within political reason. Okay, political technologies, I've suggested, are sets of knowledge practices. My shorthand there. Has become an object of knowledge. The chapter describes how a critical infrastructure, specifically vulnerabilities, because they go together, has become an object of knowledge. Okay, so I mean it's really quite that. This is why I chose it as an article. We're also trying to write about these objects of knowledge.
One of the interesting steps there is that the critical infrastructure becomes, in a sense, a found object, and then the vulnerability of that found object becomes this object of knowledge. So there's a sort of a little two-step they do there, saying that those vital systems are givens, the vulnerability of which we now need to deal with, which is interesting. And at some point later in the article, they catalogue some of the things that constitute critical infrastructure, which notably leaves out an interesting range of things, but that's
and which grows and grows.
Grows and grows, depending on the work we do.
Okay, so they're imagining certain types of events as a crucial set of making knowables of this vulnerability. Okay, so they're I think that's right. They've just assumed infrastructure is this found object, and then vulnerabilities are these objects of knowledge. And now they're talking about the various practices of making vulnerabilities knowable, and they're focusing on one particular subset, if you like, which they're calling events. Okay, so this is their aim. According to what rationality and with what aim do material things become political? But that's not really what we're doing. That's where they're taking their chapter. So we're reading across that idea. Okay, so then their first section is associating infrastructure and vulnerability, showing how vulnerability emerges with infrastructure, and brings up the political project of infrastructure protection. See, I'm just swishing through this because they're doing a genealogy here. That's that's the Foucauldian method, and we're not. Probably most of us are not doing genealogies. Okay, so now they're beginning to get into practices of making knowable. So vulnerability mapping is one of the practices of making vulnerability knowable. Okay, quite a long section, and goes back to the Cold War.
Can I just make something that I
Sure.
I'm not sure if it's a war
Just
thing.
stop if
Sorry.
you've got anything. Just stop us. Stop me if you've got anything to say.
One of the things I thought was interesting there, as they did that, was that there was a point at which they, in terms of thinking about how they would bomb other places, they started to think about themselves as bombable.
Being bombed.
And so that sort of, that imaginary act that they presumably came up in terms of thinking actually about them, became a relation back to themselves. And so there's some interesting two-stepping. So we imagine that if we would then, they would attack us like this, which means that if we're going to do that, then we need to go after particular kinds of things. And I'm just wondering if that sort of self-other thing that's at work there is of use to us in terms of trying to do this governance stuff. And I don't know the answer to that, but that was what I was thinking as I read it.
Yeah, so that, I mean, that's a classic move in genealogy. You find the way in which one move brings about another origin, or origin of something else. So it could be.
I think I recall from the article that it also happened that the people that were planning the bombing at the last stages of the Second World War, probably bombing Dresden, they didn't have a job after the war, and they had to find something to do with these guys. So that they said, okay, well, let's just go back onto civil defence, and created a whole notion of civil defence out of it. And it's a bit like Tesley's book about the bureaucrats and bleeding hearts. It's about how the health bureaucracy, when problems get solved, they have to think of another problem in order to keep themselves in the job somehow. So I think there's that part of it as well, that there's actually this sort of the impetus that's already there that means that you actually have to do something with these people and with these ideas and with this infrastructure in order to just keep being profitable and progressive.
Yeah, and turning the vast enterprise that invented the atomic bombs into electricity generation is a sort of classic example of that. You have Eisenhower launching the Swords into Plowshares project, it was called.
And some of those scientists involved in the bomb were biologists. Well, they about the crystallographers, and that's how we became to understand DNA. That's according to Compass just last week.
Right. Okay.
Because they went back to Britain and they needed work and wanted to get right away from the whole bomb scenario, so turned their attention to biology.
Makes me think that maybe the two manifestations of those quality assurance documents or systems, that one followed the other, not because the first was succeeding and therefore it might make it better, but in fact because it was failing. But also, I quite like that notion that where they say right at the beginning they're talking about when Starr emphasising that infrastructure is a fragile accomplishment and point to moments of breakdown as sites in which the work of infrastructure suddenly becomes visible.
That's the classic understanding of infrastructure, that it just disappears into the background and people take it for granted and forget it's there, and it only becomes visible when it breaks down. I think that might have been right at some point, but I think that I think that's changing. I think people find infrastructure exciting now, and you get all these ads about electricity infrastructure is exciting.
And possibly see it, warts and all, already.
Yeah. I think infrastructure is exciting now.
Yeah.
It's not taken for granted anymore. It's a site where money can be made and enterprise developed.
Yeah.
And votes won.
And votes won and opportunities created.
But it's stopped.
And that document was linked to the future of society, wasn't it? It was, if you want to have this society in the future that isn't going to be really expensive, then you've got to assure this, got to do this now with these children, even though they're this hidden part of our society that we don't think are very important.
Yes, but these brains are a
there's this
crucial part of the future infrastructure.
vulnerability for our society is right here.
I think one of the political technologies that they use for that is what they call opportunity cost, where they're actually saying this is, if you don't do this now, then you're going to have all these expenses a bit further on, so that they're actually calculating, a bit like the Helen's Post, that they're actually calculating the cost of not doing something in terms of their future ramifications.
Well, that was that figure on Helen's bestiary. One of those figures was a figure on the cost of not doing something, wasn't it?
Yes, one of the numbers.
I think you could generate a cost of not doing something for a lot of, could generate that, I'm sure, easily for the cost of not doing feasibility stuff as opposed to doing.
Yeah, I think that's why opportunity cost has become almost a science now. That people probably know, because they just people say we can't do this, we can't afford it, and somebody comes along, well, what about the opportunity cost that you really do need to.
So is opportunity cost of counting on non-Euclidean fingers? Like what is?
It was the Stern with the climate change report in Britain was a famous one that was really trying to change the game by saying if you don't do this, it will cost 0.5% of GDP if you just start doing it now, and it will cost all of this money as a political tactic to try and change the way that people think about it. It seemed to work in Britain, and it didn't hold and transfer over to Australia.
Also that fear-based, something about being fear-based. If you don't do, like a threat, like a threat.
Well, certainly this paper's about that. And people are starting to worry about, gee, we did such a bad job of bombing those guys. They're going to come back and bomb us. And then there was the Cuban crisis and then there was the 9/11, and then floating down, if it wasn't Katrina coming along, so nature's doing it to us. So there's a panic.
Especially because it had political implications, Katrina, didn't it? It was...
Yes, the citizens would rise up against us because
they said we were neglected because we were black.
And they defunded this very thing before, and they were going to do stuff in New Orleans, and they said, oh, no, we can't afford it, we don't need to do that. And then it all happened.
So then they get to the scenario, which I think is, in a way, one of their core points, the scenario as an object of making knowable, and the scenario is a form of event. So they're in a way they're arguing for an odd sort of object, an object that is an event, an imaginative enactment, they're calling it.
So is it a technology as well as an object?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not an object that is part of a political technology.
No, I think objects and political technology are one and the same.
Yeah.
Sometimes it makes more sense to think of it as a political
I
technology. And
thought
other
political technology produced objects,
and objects produce political technologies, and sometimes they're one and the same thing.
So when you say the task associated with this reading involves us in attempting to name the political technology that constitutes the habitat for our objects collectively.
Yes, I think
You want to resile from that.
that's right. I think that was the hope that I mean, at this point I'm trying to work out how it all might be tied together. I haven't met any of the objects. I keep thinking of an object that I might use and then it doesn't work, and then I think of another one and so on. So, I mean, I wrote these tasks quite some weeks ago now, and as we all know, the closer it gets, the more focused our thinking becomes.
Okay, so let's just say...
Don't take that too literally.
Okay.
And I mean, what I wanted to pull out this idea of infrastructure and infrastructure thinking. I think this risk management and articulating vulnerabilities and so on is one of the moments where the sort of wider notion of infrastructure thinking is coming from. And at that point I was imagining infrastructure as a working imaginary as a habitat in which our objects live. I think that still works, but it may not.
And then if the object is a different thing for different people, then there's different working imaginaries.
Yes,
there's the multiplicity.
And sometimes the object's the habitat. So it's not very good as a setup. Okay, so then they go down to all hazards planning, which I guess is a sort of and enhanced the scenario.
Yeah, but constantly, like, there's a thing here where they went through an exercise at the Darwin Hospital, which happened post-Bali bombing, but it's not like it's more recent than that, which is how do we cope with some huge event in our region? And so, you know, they've done all this stuff to say, okay, we can cope with this, we can do that, we can do whatever. But it does seem when you read all of this, just sort of tail chasing to a certain extent. So the notion of this scenario relies on us imagining the things out of our field of possible thinking, and then tells us what it is we need to worry about. But in fact, we're all, you know, it's all complete sort of mysterious future, obviously.
Is Pitch Black another example of that? Operation Pitch Black. And, you know, whether
And also the Bali bombing,
the Orange Landers.
Yeah.
Like the Orange Landers, do you remember that? No, the Orange Landers, what was that one? Did they all they had them invading armies, and we all had to.
Oh, yeah.
They turned our whole community into an invaded community, and we were actually held hostage. And what happened? The hospital was held hostage. What happened?
I think on the reverse, I was in London when it got bombed, and I think probably as a result of a lot. I mean, London's got a long history of being bombed anyway, because we had the IRA would bomb London like it was quite frequent. So it wasn't as if it was an improbable event; it was quite probable. But the efficiency that everyone dealt with it was very impressive. Like all the hospitals had plans, all the doctors, all the nurses, they had, you know, very good systems that, you know, everything did work, and they did cope with it like very well, really. I had a friend who was a nurse at one of the hospitals. To be overrun, like the airports were on standby in case they had to airlift people to other hospitals outside. So I think on that side of it, it was, you know, it was quite a good thing that all these scenarios had been taking place and happening. But then, on the other hand, like when we get one day of snow, the whole thing just completely falls down. But then, you know, we get 5 days of snow a year and everyone enjoys like snow day. So it's, I don't know, I guess it's different, like, it's the probability and then the fear, I guess, like you were saying, the fear of it happening.
Well, we're not saying whether or not they're good. It's good. It's just we're just noting it as a technology, as an example, as a way that is making this infrastructure really visible to us, and all of these things are.
Okay, so imaginative enactment, of which scenario is one, and then there are various other versions of it. It's a way to generate knowledge about current needs in the face of future events. It's a central tool. Okay, so that's their object. So I just went through and thought, okay, what's their object and how are they investigating their object? They're writing an analytic paper or an analytic article about an object. So it's actually quite interesting for us to see how they're doing it. Not because we're going to do it in the same way, but it's a very similar task to the one that we've set ourselves.
Yeah, but there's a very interesting that notion that sort of low probability, high concept. Like there's an interesting sort of imaginative step that's been made there in terms of thinking. You know, so it's rather than that sort of indexical. You know, this is what happened in the past. That we just lay that out into the future, which is how lots of that stuff actually used to be done. This is all part of the imagination of saying there's actually different ways of thinking about our futures. And so that, to draw it back to our stuff, part of our task is how can us thinking about our little objects and doing our work change the ways we imagine the world unfolding around us.
Yeah.
There's high probability, high consequence interventions.
Yes. How could we do work that does work, as Neil's friend said. Okay, so here this seems to me they're beginning to sum up at this point. They're really keen on their objects as an event or an enactment. It's not a prediction, a forecast, or a model. It's an intervention in the present.
Isn't it all of those things though, Helen? Isn't it a prediction, a forecast and a model and an intervention?
No, because they argue that here's there's just an act of imagination. Like we don't know, we say that a 2.4 kiloton bomb will explode 1.5 kilometres above, the second water tower on the right in Oklahoma City, or whatever it might be. So
they're not saying it's going to happen.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, I didn't finish reading the
Yeah.
sentence and how the future will unfold.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. It's a Jeffrey Robinson hypothetical.
Yeah.
Although it does say that preparedness does not seek to prevent the occurrence of a disastrous event, but rather assumes that it will happen.
Yeah. So it's not at all directed towards being nice to terrorists in order to stop it from happening. It's just saying, let's say that assume that they're completely implacable and it is going to happen. So you just need to be ready for any possible eventuality.
Okay, so it's about anticipating types of decisions. And that's so it's forcing people to do in the present, intervening to have people do now something that they might have to do in the future. So that's the actual sort of intervention that it is.
And that's a nice little thing there. In a time of relative calm on their options.
It's what St John's Ambulance has been doing in its first aid classes for decades, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. And their third point is that it's that there's no distinction between the natural and the social yet.
And the people who made that link would have been so delighted with themselves because they realised that their area of expertise is suddenly radically widened to natural disasters. So they don't have to wait for the terrorists to come and they'll still have the job.
They had trouble in Haiti though, didn't they? Because they had all these plans, and because the plans had no flexibility built into them, and they had a specific order that everyone had to follow, but the reality didn't match that, and so they were all, when Haiti happened, they had all these supplies, but they weren't allowed in to give the supplies because it didn't follow the order. They had to wait for the area to be secure before they could go in, and the people that were secure in the area were taking a long time, so the humanitarian people had to wait, and everyone had these plans, and there was no one there to say, well, the plan's obviously a bit silly. So it sort of, in some ways, it hindered it as well, just because there wasn't in Haiti when they had the earthquake in Haiti. They had, the delay with the bureaucratic ones, wasn't there?
It would be interesting to know the political technology behind this kind of thing versus that kind of thing. Like what are they the same political technology in that they say, okay, in these situations, this is what we need to mobilise? So they sort of ossify into a plan that says do this and then do that? Or do they come with this sort of... it seems to me that this is saying that there's this whole sort of flexible set of stuff that enables us to be more responsive.
Yeah, I think as well it's like scenarios. So for that one though, like they had a scenario and all the humanitarian went in and they all got, raided and injured. So they were like, they made a plan and said, okay, so we can't have the humanitarian people go in because it's not safe for them.
Mm-hmm.
So then we had to have the security coming in, and they didn't really build in, like you were saying before, like just the scale, like then there's like a scale of things. Instead they just said it's not safe or it is safe, and there wasn't anything in between. And so I guess sometimes governance can, like when something, when the object of governance comes apart from reality and has no flexibility to bring it back, that makes sense.
Is it kind of what we're doing by them saying here in Northern Australia there are then all these things that are blowing apart what could be the assumed event? If that,
Or anomalies.
or the,
Like anomalies.
well, yeah, that it's in the, like it's like Mike was saying before, not to think what the government's thinking and wanting, but what we're swimming in, like the clan. I don't know. But maybe that's exactly when we're saying, because it seems like that one of the threads that is running through all of these is that we are looking at the existing structure, whether it's infrastructure, maybe, but then how that manifests is actually being constantly teased apart by the reality of Indigenous communities, Indigenous work with Indigenous people, the interpretation of the infrastructure that's not the same. And so we've got to look back at what we're swimming in rather than... It's my head that's swimming, actually.
Yeah, so this is really the last paragraph of the article, and they're looking at this political technology, or this little set of objects that they've displayed for us, and saying they're not like the precautionary principle that tries to stop things happening, but rather they enact through scenarios and so on, through these objects, a vision of a dystopian future to develop a set of operational criteria for response. Preparedness does not seek to prevent the occurrence of disastrous event, but rather assumes it will happen. Preparedness also requires that this notion, I think, of infrastructure thinking. Preparedness, as distinct from the precautionary principle, preparedness takes infrastructure for granted and hence vulnerabilities for granted and so on. So when I first read this, I was thinking of infrastructure as a habitat. The technology of preparedness, as exemplified in programs such as critical infrastructure protection, brings a heterogeneous set of things into political reason. Okay, that's clearly a significant assertion from our point of view, or conclusion. Through this technology, experts and officials have come to see collective life as dependent on the functioning of a series of interdependent, complex and above all highly vulnerable systems. Okay, which to me is quite a good description of infrastructure thinking. So this article was, the Foucault article was trying to get us to think in a different way about objects, but this article is trying to trying to give an example of a way of analysing when you think that way. And of course it's not really what we want to be doing. We don't want to be writing complete, full and analytic article like this. We want to tell a story which shows the practices. And so stories about how things are done are going to be important to us. Practices, because we're I hope seeing our objects as emerging out of the practices of making knowable. And so in my story, I just included one little account of practices of making knowable. And it was the way in which the senior landowner went to a certain place, having talked to certain people, and lit what he called the Yota fire, the baby fire, for this firing episode. And for the scientists, that way of making land knowable through that practice of constituting fire as a political technology was done wrongly because it should have been observed. So that's what I mean by practices, and they're rather clunky to write about. But that's what we're trying to do.
So were there two practices there, two different practices of making things knowable
Yes,
there, and they clashed ontologically?
Yes.
The fantasy was that they would have this grand joining, wasn't it? That was the
Yes.
whole point.
Yes.
They would all love each other and
Because, the assumption was, well, we all know.
fires.
Yes, that's it.
Reminds me of the long grass research and Michael project, if I remember correctly, that the government funding body, after data had been collected from people living in the long grass, then the job was to go back and somehow fix things. But the long grassers themselves were thinking that the data collection was the completion of the exercise. They didn't need fixing.
That's because the data that they had, these were Aboriginal researchers being induced to do some research on long grasses. And by the time the project had finished, they had done all the work of visiting people and making sure that they were happy and reporting back to the hospitals and things like that about how things were working. Then they had to write the report. They thought, what's the report about? It's not... We've done it. And so that there was that whole business of having to make a representation of what they'd done that was then explained to them.
Yeah, and that was just to suit the infrastructure, wasn't it?
It was to suit the technology of the political technology of representation and reporting, and a world in which the nature is out there and the governmentalities are in there.
Yeah, I think that's right.
This particular technology, where instead of just a whole lot of services getting together and thinking about all the things that they might need to do in the future in the case of a crisis, which I gather what they've done in preparing for Haiti, but in actually dramatising and putting themselves into a specific situation and exploring that situation, it would be really interesting to do that with a positive scenario. For instance, for us to imagine in 10 years' time is absolutely functioning.
Best of all possible worlds.
Aboriginal corporation functioning, and to explore. I wonder if that would be, it'd be really interesting to think about what has happened. What was the political technology that enabled that scenario?
That's what the visioning process is about.
Yeah. I think the woman that we keep referring to that told children that don't think about multiple scenarios, there is one way of doing it. That's the your way is actually that thinking about how the future must be somehow consistent with everything that we've ever done and everything we know and who we are. So I think that's actually something quite familiar to your maybe. That whole that vision of a future that's not dislocated from the past.
Well, it's a bit like Guevara's thing where she protested, I'm not lost, it's the roads that are the problem.
Yeah, and the other one that I loved, I was telling Helen the other night when he was sitting down with the old man saying, tell us how the things were different in the old days. And he said, no, they weren't different in the old days, they're different now.
That's right, I was thinking of that one. I was thinking of that one too. That was when I was doing the telephone, that was my first aha.
So can you just put that back on again? And move to the left-hand page. And the characteristic of political technology, it defines and regulates targets of intervention according to a normative rationality. Now that...
Where's that bit?
That bit there, yeah. So that they're almost saying, no, it wasn't different in the old days, it's different now. That is in itself a normative rationality, isn't it? That there is a rationality that underlies the imaginary, the working imaginary, that is actually quite different for your more, but it's still normative in a sense, and it's still rational in a sense, in the sense of rational, which is not an objectivist representational rationality. I think that's actually quite interesting in the way you're talking about two different sorts of governmentalities. We need to think about the work that they do trying to regulate everything and everybody else in a normative sort of a way.
Yes.
And that they're both actually doing it busily and unawares of each other in a sense. And maybe it's the objects that help us to see how those two things are working or failing to work together.
Well, that would be the idea of a feasibility study, to make those visible. Make those governmentalities visible.
Yeah, there's certainly a normative rationality behind a feasibility study, isn't there?
Which could be opened up to other kinds of normative rationality.
There's a desire on the part of my understanding is on the community that this will succeed and that it won't be a redevelopment of, or won't be the old Ramingiting Homelands Centre Corporation brought to life again. They don't want that. They want something different because they know that there was something that wasn't working well there.
Yes, and my interest, for me, the interest
So
of
they
my
want
story
to
is what influence that building might exert, because it's so embedded. It was so co-constituted with the old entity.
So basically, we don't know. We're just, each of us is just going to take our steps, trying to turn our little text into a bigger one. And the readings might help. Some of the conversations that we've had that are recorded on live stream might help. And there are other ways in which we can support each other.
There's a lot at stake. It's not just a writing. It's not just something that we're writing for a journal. For me, there's a lot at stake.
Yeah,
and trying to...
Because you're using it to think through things that really matter.
Absolutely. And trying to do that acting in very good faith and not being sure about whether the whole idea of doing this feasibility study is an act of good faith, even. So there's a lot, and I think other people probably have a lot at stake too, or possibly have a lot at stake too. And so that brings something else to it. It's sort of like not just an academic exercise. So I'm a bit worried not about the writing, but about what I'm doing, and how this is influencing, or can influence.
Yeah. But I think that's really good. To me, that's a really good criteria that our academia is valid, that what you're writing is something you're worried about. It's like, it's not just writing for writing's sake. It is a political technology. It's part of it. It's part of all the political technology that we're involved in as academics, and maybe we should be, a lot more people should be worried about what they're writing,
Yeah, well, part of many people would say that we've been doing theory here, and many people would also say that the role of theory is to explain, but the way we've been doing theory is not at all to offer any sort of explanation, but rather to try to come up with a way of navigating. So we're using theory here as a form of navigating tool, and as a way of allowing us to do academic work in good faith.
Well, isn't that the argument that the actor network theorists had with themselves about whether actor network theory was a method or a theory? Like,
yes, I'm just using theory in theory as method or.
I think, Anthony, when you said before that we ought to be worrying about what we're writing, I think actually what we're doing is writing about what we're worrying about.
Yes, I'm not.
And
well,
that's what
Julie meant, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is that what you meant?
I'm not worried about
there
the
is a lot
writing.
at stake.
I'm worried about what I'm doing.
Yeah, and I think that's what I'm
writing about what you're worrying about.
But what I'm not sure about is, and that brings up that other thing too, is writing about it. Will writing about it help? Like what comes first, the chicken and the egg? Is it an intervene? And is what we do? Is the theory actually not? It's a way, it's a tool, but is it? I was thinking as you were saying it, is it an intervention?
But it's about writing about what we're worrying about, but also writing about what we're worrying, as in disturbing.
Dog worrying, yes.
But yeah, it seems to me nice that it has the possibility of not just being a retrospective story about a thing that happened. In fact, the writing is the opening up. And then, again, the dual participation, the active writing and putting it into a journal gives, as part of our responsibility to the places that we inhabit and the world that makes these places possible. But doing that in a new and, well, it's not new, but in a non-retrospective way. We're not trying to parcel it up and say, I've got the definitive story about that episode back there.
That makes it different than the previous ethnography last time.
Yeah.
It was reflective.
Yes.
I was wondering if anybody had anything more to say about the scenario planning stuff. Whether is it, I can see that it kind of intensifies things and maybe creates something that wasn't intended. But say, for example, with my object, that poster, there was a lot of scenario planning happening before it finally got committed. It could be used in this situation. It could look like this. And then I don't mind a good role play. Along with lots of you all don't mind a good role play. So I'm just wondering about what do we need to look out for with that scenario planning? What is it? How do we need to trick ourselves up that we don't create problems for ourselves?
Yeah, that we're actually intervening in the present and not modelling a future.
It seems to me, Trevor, that you chose the poster as a sort of a scenario style thing because you didn't want to buy into the government's, this is the poster about the cyber safety, didn't want to buy into the whole government disciplinary top-down, you naughty boys, stop doing this or something terrible is going to happen to you, and use the scenarios of ways of talking about the multiplicity of possibilities that came out of those technical objects. So that there are ways in which scenarios are being used by you, for example, to be very generative and productive, and they don't expand the horror of future disaster in the way that these particular scenarios do. So they can be very fruitful and productive.
That was different than a scenario, though. That was a lot of possibilities that you created the scenarios out of yourself. Like it was like you had that multiplicity, as opposed to these scenarios seem to be more like a set of things, and then you respond to those sets of things. So there's not that.
But I imagine as we move into the feasibility study, there's going to be these scenarios that we're imagining and re-presenting them somehow.
Or not.
Or I'm not sure what's going to happen. And in a sense, it's silly to worry until we actually start bumbling along and doing things. But I can imagine it being a little more dangerous with setting up a Aboriginal corporation creating scenarios, then especially because somebody's already said, well, we only want to set up the right one. So thinking through scenarios, options, scenarios.
Can you give an example? Do you mean that, like, should the board have 8 people as directors? Or should it have 10? Or should it have 4? And if we have 10, then quorum is 5. And are we ever going to get,
And
that kind of...
we can go down the simple ORIC route, or look, there's this mob at Wadeye doing this stuff, and it's looking really amazing. Is that something that we should explore?
It's got different imaginations of what it might be based on different sets of factors. So,
but it does sound like the people are saying, yeah, if we just get together and start talking about it, we'll find the way it needs to be. How many directors?
but it's happened before.
How do we not
create a problem? How do we? They want something the same and something different.
Mm-hmm. And it does need some crisis scenario building. Like I was reading in that ORIC document why Aboriginal No, if you go online, actually if you just go online, you can bring up court cases of Aboriginal organisations that have failed. And down at Nooka, there was an amazing situation where they brought in a volunteer, an elderly volunteer with a good pedigree, and within a short time he had aligned with some of the people on the board, and they headed to Darwin and went to the bank and tried to transfer money into another account because this person had bought into some political struggle between two entities that existed in the town. And then contrasting that, Henry Harper said that when they set up another Aboriginal corporation, it might have even been ELPA, they deliberately wrote in, they had a huge number of members, like a vast membership, which with ill-defined edges, and they built into the constitution that you had to have 3/4 of the membership in order to change something. In other words, you've built in that it can never be changed. So there's all these scenarios that we may have to enliven in people's minds to do some of this
Yeah, but they're going to be political choices and choices of imagination. You can't do all
So
of it.
nice.
So the reason that we could use scenarios is that to make the infrastructure visible to ourselves. Is that what it is? What is the reason why we would, not, what's the underlying, the deeper possibilities of using scenarios?
I think that that's a question to do with our strategy for our projects rather than our strategies for our writing. So I think we should leave that
Oh yeah, okay,
for
that's a
now,
good point.
if that's okay.
No, that's a really good point.
And I think that we should break for lunch, and I hope that we can come back within 3/4 of an hour, so we've got another 3/4 of an hour just to do our summing up and reassuring each other that we know what we're doing.
Or just realising that we're all in the same boat.
So we're at 1:45.
I reckon but let's start again at 1:45. Is that okay?
Yep. Speaking of the
All right,
myself.
I'm going to go and ring Jerry. Thank you.
Right.